You're a sales representative for a big American publishing house. Have you always been tempted to see how it is on the other side of the publishing business?
Well, I don't know that I would use the word tempted as far as being in the publishing business. I gravitated towards publishing because I love books and I loved reading. I started out as a bookseller and kind of fell into the publishing side of things. And I've always enjoyed publishing and giving me the opportunity to be around books and writers. And knowing that ultimately I always wanted to be a writer, I think it was a great occupation for me, and it did give me a little insight into the business and how to best approach that type of career.
What genre, what kind of stories did you like reading as a child and later on in your teens?
Well, the stories I liked reading best as a child were action, adventure, suspense, those types of stories. The first stories I remember reading as a child were the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, which I enjoyed immensely, and I think that those stories, the fairy tales, were what gave me sort of my love for fantasy and adventure and sort of the epic stories of literature. I liked the Hardy Boys, were a big influence on me as a child. I loved mystery and stories that took me to another place, kept the pages turning, always had a cliffhanger at the end, something that kept me wanting to go on to the next chapter, the next book. As a teenager, I began to gravitate toward historical fiction. Irving Stone, John Jakes, writers like that, who took the lives of historical figures and turned them into fiction, which was not only entertaining but informative, were the types of books that I really came to love.
Do you have any literary role models?
My literary role models are many. I would say at the top of the list would be John Steinbeck. I've always been a big admirer of his work. Cannery Row by John Steinbeck is my favorite novel. I love Steinbeck because of his humanity and his passion for the best in people. I like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Larry McMurtry. There's a long list of writers that I admire and hopefully I've learned from and have tried to emulate in my own writing.
Where did you get the idea for this particular story?
The idea for The Youngest Templar actually came to me when I was reading an article in a magazine about the Grail Cathedral, which is located in Roslin, Scotland. This cathedral is rumored by many who study Grail legends and Grail myths to be the hiding place of the Holy Grail. It's been part of conspiracy theories and studied for centuries, literally. People have done every type of excavation and search throughout the cathedral looking for the Grail itself. So far, they've never been able to find it. And as I read this story, I thought to myself for a moment, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Holy Grail actually does exist and that it is hidden somewhere in this massive cathedral in Scotland. If that's true, how did the Grail get there? And that was the first germ for this story of taking this sacred and holy artifact and moving it from the Holy Land to Scotland. How did that happen? And I wanted to sort of fill in the missing details of that story, and that was the first beginning of The Youngest Templar.
Have you always been interested in the Knights Templar?
I've always been fascinated by the Knights Templar, like many people. I'm not the first writer to write about the Knights Templar. I won't be the last. They're a fascinating topic for discussion. They were basically this poor monastic order that came to power rapidly and suddenly, became suddenly almost the most powerful force in the world, in the Christian world at least. If you think about it, more powerful than monarchs and kings. And how did that happen? Their history is so short, but so their growth and their influence is so rapid and developing that they become great fodder for historians and conspiracy theorists, and everyone who has an interest in the Crusades is undoubtedly a big fan of the lore and legend of the Knights Templar.
What role does the Holy Grail play in the development of Tristan, the main protagonist?
Well, the Holy Grail has been a symbol in literature for centuries, literally, from the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and I'm sure there'll be many more stories that are written about the Grail after this one. But in The Youngest Templar, the Grail really functions as a symbol of Tristan's growth as a human being. He starts out as rather this callow, sheltered youth. He's taken in by Sir Thomas Liu, who is a knight of the Temple, and trained in the ways of the Templars. And at a very critical point in the story, he's given possession of the most sacred and holy object in all of Christendom. And this object suddenly becomes Tristan's instrument for moving from childhood into young adulthood and eventually to manhood. And it becomes a symbol of duty and honor and respect for his knight, who obviously felt that this object was something that was so important and needed to be safeguarded, and that Tristan is the only one with whom he trusted with that duty. So it becomes the symbol of his maturity.
What gave you the idea for the threesome of friends? Tristan, Robard Hoad, and Marianne.
The three friends in the story started out in much different ways than what they ended out. Robard Hoad, for example, who is the young Robin Hood, I never intended for him to insert himself in the entire book. What I had originally planned when I started writing was that he and Tristan would have this brief meeting, and then he would move on and they would meet up later in the trilogy. However, he became such a forceful personality and such a forceful character that he kind of demanded to be in the book. And he stayed in the story, and I think the book became much richer for his presence. And it was kind of the same thing with Marianne. I had intended for Tristan to come in contact with a member of this Al-Hashashin cult to which Marianne belongs. And as it turned out, she gave a nice balance to these two young warriors. And she also inserted herself in the story and ended up staying ultimately until the very end of the trilogy. I don't think I started out at the beginning of the story believing that I was going to have this triumvirate of these three characters. They just sort of grew out of the story organically.